So normally my primary research is in linguistic theory, syntax, comparative grammar, especially Russian syntax, and theory of syntax. And so today's talk is not in my primary area of research, but it is a very popular area of research right now in cognitive science, which is the connection between language and music. That's why we had music at the beginning, right? So to make, we have language during the conference, but we need to have music during the conference. So this is a big area now in cognitive science, very big. And I only have 30 minutes, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what's happening in cognitive science with music and language and what is really controversial right now. So, okay. I was so ready for Russian. Okay, what is controversial? Yeah, I know. It's like you have to change your worldview, right? You have to change your языковая картина мира, right? So I'm trying to change it back to English. So this is what's controversial, is from a cognitive science point of view, how much of the way music is organized in the mind and the way language is organized in the mind use the same systems, the same resources, the same structures, or how are they separate? That's really the question. Okay? So what I'll tell you very quickly is background about modularity of mind, which is a important area of cognitive science right now, where every mental ability is its own module, right, which in Russian is modul, right? And there's a language module and a musical module, and one for vision, and one for touch, and one for concepts, and every part of mental cognitive activity, right? And then the question is, what are the connections between the music module and the language module? And how deep, like here, deep. How deep are those connections? Are they of course there's some similarity, obvious similarities, obvious differences, but what is the real cognitive situation? Okay? And so I'll tell you some significant similarities, some significant distinctions at the end, and then I won't tell you my own opinion, unless you ask me. Okay? Because this is this is the thing that people throw things at each other at conferences. Like when they don't agree, it's very important stuff. Okay. So the idea of modularity of mind goes back to Jerry Fodor and Ray Jackendorf, and these are some references, and maybe we can put the slides on some website so they can look at them later if you're interested. These, especially Jerry Fodor's Modularity of Mind, 1983, where he said, look, every part of mental activity is a separate machine in your mind. It's not a general intelligence. We have general intelligence, but for special purposes, we have special machines. So for, representing concepts, we have one machine. For representing language and working with language, we have another machine. And for music, he didn't talk about music. Fodor did not talk about music, but the same ideas apply. And you can add, physical abilities, ability to move, ability to dance, ability to understand what you touch, to understand what you see, to understand what you hear, all of these things, to understand what you smell, right? That how you connect a smell to an idea, a picture to an idea, a musical signal to some kind of emotions or something like that. And there's many connections among these things, but the crucial thing of modularity is separate systems, right? And every system has this same kind of structure, right? Every system takes some kind of input, physical input, like light for vision, or sound for music, or sound for language, or maybe not sound because it might be, if it's a sign language, then it's sight for, or touch for touch, and so on. And so it has an input, and then it converts that physical signal into some kind of organization, right? So in language, it converts sound into phonemes, and phonemes into syllables, and syllables into morphemes, and morphemes into phrases, and phrases into sentences, and sentences into meaning, right? You cannot go directly from blah, 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 to meaning. You have to organize it into many different levels. It's well known for language, and the same is true for music as well. There's a surface of sounds, and then you organize it into notes, in tones, in scales, in phrases, and so on, right? And that's true for all the systems. And it's true for vision also. First you organize it into some dark and light, and then some boundaries, and then some objects, and then some objects in 3 dimensions, and so on, right? So all these, but think about it. The input is just light, or sound, or something else, or smell. That's it. That's the only input, is just sound waves. But our mind is what organizes into these extremely complex systems. And that's what cognitive science is trying to understand, is how that works, right? So Fodor said in 1983, here's what makes something a module. What makes it a module is it has these characteristics, okay? It's fast. Right? When you process your language in your own language, your native language, you do it like that. No, you don't think about it. It's stupid. It does not stop. It cannot not do it, right? It must do it. And it does it just automatically. So it's fast, it's stupid, it's exclusive, right? So the information coming from music and the information coming from language do not interfere. Like you said, like let's leave the music na fonie. You know, we could do that. We could have music playing right now, and it would not, if it was just music with no words, it would not interfere with this talk much, right? So, right, that's because the information from music and the information language are what we call encapsulated, right? Exclusive. Number 4, it's specific. It has specific functions that deal with just that area, right? So the language module has its own functions and does things that no other module does, and the music module does things that no other module does. So that's what I called узконаправленный in Russian, like narrow-minded, you know, just focused on its own thing. And it doesn't care, like, it doesn't matter if I smell meat cooking, I'm not going to organize the music differently, right? If they don't intersect, the modules are distinct like that. And it's physical, it's neurological, because we know that, I'll show you in a few minutes, and it's innate. That is, if you're a healthy human being and you grow up in the normal circumstances, you speak a language and you understand a musical system. No problem. Right? Nobody fails to learn their native language. Okay? If they're healthy. Okay. So our language and music modules like this will definitely, they're universal. Every person has both. And they have universals, so there are some features that are present in every single language. And there are features which, of course, typologists are interested in that, right? What languages have in common, and generative grammar has been interested in that since Chomsky. And music also has those. And they have these components that are specific to a particular domain. I'll show you those in a second. And you could have possible impairment, narushenia, that only affects music or only affects language. Happens, unfortunately, right? And you don't have to be taught, and I'm not talking about music in the sense of reading notes or playing chords, or I know how to play the guitar and you don't, right? It's not that. It's just musical perception. You don't have to be taught anything to know musical perception, except you have to grow up in a culture that has music, which is every culture. Because every culture has music, every culture has language. So it doesn't depend what culture you're in. This ability works. And if you grew up in African tribal area, if you grew up in big city in Europe, it doesn't make any difference. You have a musical culture and you have a linguistic culture. And your brain works with whatever you have. And there's no culture that doesn't have a musical system. And there's no culture. And so we're interested in what all of that has in common and what it can tell us about the mind. See, now I'm starting to talk fast, right? Okay. So there's something called biolinguistics, which is this kind of approach to linguistics, which is what we do in our summer school here, and what generative grammar is doing, that tells us how we know, how we learn what's ungrammatical, because we know what's ungrammatical in our own language instinctively. And we know that, structures are asymmetrical and hierarchical, and that there's phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics are all different levels of organization, right? That's what we call multiple levels of representation. You can't learn that as a 3-year-old child. I have a 3-year-old child, right? She knows that in 2 languages already. She organizes things that way. No teaching involved. It just happens naturally. And the same thing, you can generate new sentences. You can process things you've never heard before. You can make meanings out of structures. Those things are universal, and everybody does it. So that's what the linguistic module gives us. And everybody has it. It's universal. We start very young as children. We acquire in the same order. It happens automatically. It's a very old system in human beings. It's evolutionarily very old. And it can be injured. If you get hit in the head, you can have, aphasia of different things, right? And ungrammaticality is something that's only has to do with language. So that's called domain specificity. Okay. So it might be the case that these are the basic levels, the most prominent sort of levels of the linguistic. So these are modules within modules, right? Inside the language module, there are different submodules. And if you're a phonologist, you study the phonology module. And if you're a syntactician or a semanticist, you study the syntax module and the semantics module and their interactions with the other. And I know many of you are interested in, say, looking at the program in the lexicon and how the lexicon, that's another module, right? Which is there at the top left, the lexicon, which is organized in a particular way. And if you're studying the Romance lexicon and French words of the sun or something like that, you are actually working within one module of this larger picture. So you're contributing to that as well. And that's fine. The cognitive scientists are interested in the huge architecture, right? They call it architecture. The structural connections between the different modules. But to do that, you have to understand the different modules. So you need lexicologists and you need all these people to understand what's going on. Okay, music is exactly the same. It's just not as well known. Okay, the mind organizes musical information in a very particular way. When you hear a musical signal, you already organize it. Like, I wanted to do one example from music right now. Here we go. Here's the test, okay? Here's the test. I play this song for you. You may know it, and you may not know it, right? If I can find it. Wait a second. How do I get down low here? It's in this list. All right. We'll do it a different way. We'll go to the Beatles. Universal, right? And then we'll go to, I had it on my playlist, but it didn't. I'll go to, here it is. Okay. Now, here's the test. How quickly can you figure out where to clap your hands? Ready? Here we go. Are you finished? You're finished, right? Is anybody still waiting? Like, we can go in or snap it. Right? Okay. It's actually a very complicated problem. Why don't we go like 3 times as fast? It would still be on the beat, or really slow. But we don't. And there's principles of cognitive organization that set that up for you like that. It's just like understanding language, right? You organize it into phrases, subphrases, beats. You take all this information, and there's a whole system working in there to organize it, and you just like, yeah, that's nice. You might not like it. You might like it or not like it. That's a different question. That's a very hard question. That's the hardest question. The emotional reaction to music. Nobody understands that. Nobody. But we have to understand the structure of it before we can understand the emotional part of it. But that's just one example. Then you do the same with pitch, with tone, with key, with harmony, with melody. You organize all that stuff automatically. And that's what biomusicology is studying, right? Okay. Right. So we're trying to, it's the same goals as biolinguistics. The attempt is to figure out how this works in our mind. What do we know? We know when something, what key it's in. You might not know what, re major means. You might not have any musical training. But you know if it's in the key or not in the key. And you know if someone makes a mistake when they're playing the piano, you know it's a mistake. How do you know it's a mistake, right? That kind of thing, okay? And it also has hierarchical structure, grouping multiple levels of representation. We organize this very well. We got the rhythmic organization, we've got the harmonic organization, the melodic organization. Everything is perfectly organized automatically without even thinking about it, okay? And you do not need musical training for this. Okay, so there's also these same kind of levels. And this is a famous book in this area called The Generative Theory of Tonal Music in this case, by Ray Jackanoff, who's a linguist, and Fred Laerdal, who's a composer and a musicologist. And this is the single most important book in the cognitive science of music, although things have improved, changed in the last 30 years, but this is the sort of primary work. In fact, there's more primary than any single work in linguistics. And this has sort of a system, similar, all the different sub-modules inside the module, okay? Now, how do you know that music is its own module? Well, it's the same evidence, right? It's universal. Everybody's got the ability to perceive music, everybody, okay? We start as children. Children start singing with no help, no teaching, right? It is required in a certain order. It's automatic. It's very old, evolutionarily old. And there can be specific impairments, narушения, that only affect music. So that's Fodor's characteristics of a module, have the same kind of properties that language module has. And there's something specific to music, which is tonal organization, tonalnost. So when you hear a tune, you know that it's coming back to a place, right? There's this sense of departure and return. That you know that one tone, if it's tonal music, you know that one tone is the core and it's coming back there. We could have done a different experiment. I put on the music and you tell me which is the tone, the primary tone, and people can do that. You don't know what it's called. You don't know if it's A or B or C or La or Re or whatever, that doesn't matter. But you know which one it is. That's tonal organization, and that is unique to music. Okay? And there's all sorts of musical universals. Now, physical impairments, you know about aphasia, right? Which is a physical impairment to different parts of the brain, can affect either your syntax of language or your lexicon of language. And Broca's aphasia is different from Wernicke's aphasia. You've probably heard about that in your linguistics classes, right? And there's also things like that with music. There's something called, I translated these things, but there's something called atonal disease impairment, where you cannot tell a melody. You cannot recognize a tune. You cannot keep a tune, right? Or you can remember melodies, but you can't remember. You can't do the phrasal organization, or you can't do this thing that we did, right? A rhythmic problem. Those can happen. Those are physical impairments, narушения. And the interesting thing is that there are physical impairments that affect music only, and language is totally fine. And you can read about those in these articles, and if anyone's interested, I have these articles in my computer. Or you can have aphasia, regular linguistic aphasia, and musically you're fine. In fact, music is sometimes used as a therapy to help people who have linguistic aphasia. So the systems are separate, it seems, okay? Now, linguistic universals, I don't have to tell you, everybody knows there's parts of speech, there's hierarchical structure, there's discrete perception of phonemes, right? So that it's hard for you guys to tell the difference between Snickers and sneakers, because you don't have E distinction like or E distinction like we do in English. I know that I can feel it automatically because in my, Snickers is a chocolate, the sneakers is my shoes, right? And there's nothing in between, right? Or like polka and polka in Russian, whatever. Every language is organized that way. And music is organized that way too, of course, right? And the multiple levels of representation are universal, and all the restrictions, all the things that cause ungrammaticality, all the things that's what generative syntax and linguists are worried about, is why you can't do this, or why you can't, even in Russian with free word order, why you can't do whatever you want. Actually, it's not so free. That's what my own research is about Russian syntax. It's not so free, despite what they tell me. It's more like English than it looks. And in music, we have universals also. Even though some musical systems are not like Mozart, right? Whereas we're native speakers of different languages. Or my native language is American English, whatever. But all musical systems, even some of those crazy systems in India with 22 tones in the scale, that are hard for me to even listen to, they still have octaves. Octaves are always perceived as identical, right? That's on the piano you can see them, but when you do an experiment with any people, they perceive them as identical. And there's hierarchical structures in music. There's discrete perceptions of different tones, right? So we don't hear if someone plays a note halfway in between this note and that note, we don't hear it halfway in between. We hear it as out of tune, or it's this one or that one, Snickers or sneakers, right? Yeah. That's the same, and there's multiple levels of representation and extreme constraints on what's possible and what's not possible also. So they look the same, right? The two systems look basically more or less the same. Now, in language, you can do these experiments I can show you some ungrammaticality in English that is truly horrible ungrammaticality when you ask questions. This is a perfectly good question. What does John think that Mary loves? She loves chocolate. I think that she loves chocolate, right? But you can't say, what did John ask why Mary loves? Huh? I asked why Mary loves chocolate. What did you ask why Mary? It's totally ungrammatical. That's a W.H. Island. The why blocks the what. And we draw trees of this and do the structures and stuff. And same thing, I met an agent, spies and agents. I met an agent who loves chocolate. What did you meet an agent who loves? It's completely obvious what it means, but it's totally ungrammatical. It's not conceptually difficult. There's no problem with the semantics. It's just a pure syntactic violation. You have exactly the same stuff in Russian, believe me, because this is what I work on. Like 7b, что Иван встретил агента, который любит. What? What? Right? But it's obvious what you're saying. Он встретил человека, который любит что-то. And you're asking about that что-то. But you can't. It's completely ungrammatical. You have to do it some other way. Right? The semantics are fine, but the syntax is out. Those are just aspects of the linguistic module that's specific to language. There's nothing conceptual or visual or musical about that. That is pure linguistic restriction. Okay? And in music, you have this thing about tonality, right? You have octaves are identical, you have tonal organization, and the scale, the do, re, mi, fa, so, the scale, the basic scale. We have a scale that's different from a scale in India, right? But all scales have one thing in common. The steps in the scale are not the same size. There's whole steps and half steps, right? And our major scale is 2 whole steps, a half step, 3 whole steps, and a half step. That's how it goes. And the minor scale is 1 whole step and 2, it's just a different order. But the point is, from octave to octave, you break it up into 4 to 7 pieces, but the distance between those pieces is not the same. That's called asymmetrical scales. Every single musical culture uses asymmetrical scales. And you can see why. Because if it was symmetrical, you wouldn't know where you were. Every step would have the same feeling as the step next to it, and you wouldn't know when you're coming back to the tone or not, right? It has to be asymmetrical so that you can organize. So as soon as you hear 3 notes, if I had a piano, I would play you a couple notes, and you will already know where we are, right? You know where we are and where we're going back to. that's because of asymmetrical. I know. 5 minutes. Yes. Okay, here we go. Well, we started a little late, right?
Yeah, we did.
Okay. Okay. All right. So anyway, here we go with the similarities and the differences. I'm in the last section anyway. Okay, so the similarities are the universality of these things. Everybody has them both. There's ungrammaticality, ill-formedness in both systems. They use sound, except for sign languages, right? They use tones, they use pitches. And this thing, the metrical system, is kind of similar in language to music. In language, you also have strong beats and weak beats, right? Strong stress, glavnu udarение, right? That kind of thing. You have that, and you can draw these pictures of a musical selection and a linguistic selection, and the many X's mean stronger beat, one X means weaker beat. They're not the same, though, at all, but they're similar. They're similar. They use the same thing, right? And then this guy came. Okay, so everything looked very good until this guy came along. Okay? A good friend of mine, I don't know him actually, who's called Patel. He wrote a book about music and language, and he's an experimenter in cognitive science. And he says, look, the two systems use the same neurology. They're the same. Okay, one has notes, one has words, but they use the same resources. So he has this thing called, when you come up with your own theory, keep it short. the name. His name is the Shared Syntactic Integration Resource Hypothesis. Even the abbreviation is long, right? That's stupid. But it's an important idea, which is that, yes, we have different pieces, but the system for integrating it all is the same system, and he thinks he has evidence from brain scans that show activation of the same systems when you have a mistake in a linguistic, like a grammaticality mistake, or a wrong note in music. And what he did is he put music and language together for a person, like he put a person in the box, and then he gave them language that has a mistake, like a wrong ending, wrong case, and a musical mistake at the same time. And to see should the brain, if they're separate systems, it should activate twice as strongly. But it doesn't activate twice as strongly. It only activates a little more strongly with two mistakes. So that means, he says, well, it's because it's the same system. It's not. So this is a very tricky methodology. And he is saying that musical and linguistic syntax are basically the same system, just using different pieces. And it might not sound that important to you, but it's pretty important because it's an attack against modularity. And modularity is one of the central parts of cognitive science. And luckily, there's my colleague at Stony Brook University, and in his experimental lab, I don't do experimental work, but he does, in the experimental linguistic laboratory at Stony Brook University, is running experiments to show, to test these ideas about language, music, mathematics, and visual narrative, like comics, cartoons, the structure of cartoons, to see whether or not, when you have problems, the same areas are activated or not. It's work in progress. Right now it looks like Patel is wrong. Partially wrong, at least. And that makes sense to us because there are these things that are totally different. This is my last thing. I'm really almost finished. Which is that, and this is the English version, right? In Russian it would have been much longer. There's nothing like melody in language. Nothing. Now you say, oh, there's intonation. The music of language, yes, of course, but it's not the same. There's no tonality. There's no one pitch, which is the home that you keep coming back to. That's just not true. There's no fifth, четвертая степень, пятая степень. There's nothing like that, right? There's just high and low and up and down, but there's no tonality and there's no scales, gamma. There's nothing like that, right? And I have an extra slide on that if you want to ask about any questions. And there's nothing like the phrasing of music, like, A, B, B, A, section 1, A, B, B, A, section 2, sonata form, C, whatever. There's nothing like that in language. There can be in poetry, but poetry is partially music. That's the point. That's why it's brilliant, because it's partially language and partially music, right? but not regular language. And in music, there's nothing like words, right? There might be themes that you recognize, like da 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 da, Beethoven's Fifth, or but those are more like idioms, right? Those are not real. Those are like cliches. Those are not really words, basic units that combine with other units. There's nothing like that in music, and there's nothing like syntax in the way that I do those questions and stuff. There's nothing like that in music. So the conclusion. See, here we go. Заключение. Fodor is right and Patel is wrong. That's it, right? That there's a lot of similarity, but the modularity hypothesis, and that it really is important because we don't know very much about neurology. Cognitive neuroscience is very young. It doesn't know much about what's going on. You know that something's fire in the brain. That's all we can tell. You can't do experiments about this unless you're asking the right questions. And the right questions have to be very specific questions, right? What part of how does syntax controlled, how is semantics controlled? And so you have to really understand what you're asking to figure out whether or not these things are, how similar these things are. And there's a movement now towards, away from modularity, towards sort of understanding of general systems, which I think doesn't make theoretical sense and doesn't have any experimental support yet. Maybe Patel, in 10 years, I'll come back and say, okay, Patel was right. But I think he's not. And then there's the question of evolution, and I won't say anything about that at all. Okay? Thank you. That's okay, so before we have a discussion, if you want, here's our summer school that takes place here. Do we have people who've been there? Yes? Yay!
Here's some flyers.
And there's some flyers for it. This is and we're having a course this summer in evolution of language by one of the someone new, a world specialist from Edinburgh, Scotland, UK, on evolution of language. But so there's a lot of linguistics, psychology, but also cultural studies. It takes place here. You can go, so just remember this, NYI SPBRU, and you can go and check it out, or you can take one of these little flyers and check it out. It's a 3-week school that we have run. This will be the 12th consecutive year that we have run it right here in this courtyard, right here in this building in July. So welcome you all to come. It's not very expensive, and we have little grants this year, something new, for anybody who is studying in St. Petersburg or Northwest region of Russia, which is all of you. So it's not very expensive anyway, but that helps. Okay, yes. I had to do that. It's my other job. Okay, thank you. And you can ask in Russian if you want. It's okay.
Now I'm confused. What about singing? I was wondering if it is a combination of two modules, or it is one module and the other one.
So not even singing, but just songs. Anything that has words and music. Yeah, it's a great question. It's similar to poetry, right? Because poetry is basically language, but it has a lot of musical rhythm, and it has rhyme, which is a kind of a musical thing. And song is primarily music, but of course it has words. I don't know. I mean, when they do these experiments, they keep the music without words, so it's pure music and then pure language problems to try to understand the connection better from taking the pieces apart. But all I can say is song is a very powerful thing, right? I mean, and part of why it's so powerful, I think, is because it has these components from different modules, right? Because it is, I mean, think about it. The music in a song, in rock music, right, which is maybe the most popular music ever, people will kill themselves to get a ticket to that concert, right? Before the internet, we had to sleep in line. We had to go there, get there the night before, sleep in the line to wait for the ticket office to open in the morning, right? I mean, people will do anything to when the new album of your favorite band comes out, it's a big deal. Now you just download it from Krugi or whatever, but you know what I mean, right? And then if you look at the music, it's very simplistic, right? It has Sometimes the melody is okay, but the chords are very simple compared to classical music, right? But people, which is also very popular, of course. But there's something about the modern music that is, I mean, it's much simpler than classical music musically, but it's much more emotionally powerful to some people, right? So some people will kill themselves for that song that only has one chord, right? It's all la minor, you know, but it's still a great song, right? So what is that? Why is it so powerful if it only has one chord and it's a most primitive thing? Well, it must be something about the combination, right? So nobody understands the emotional side of music very well. There is a huge literature about it. It's not that people haven't tried. There is a huge academic, whatever, literature about what we call affect, the emotional reaction to music. But I think it's garbage. Nobody understands anything. We don't even understand the most basic things. So it's almost asking a question which is too difficult. We have to get there slowly, right? It's like in the 19th century when they were asking about physics and we didn't know about the atom, so we couldn't understand the questions about chemistry, right? But it is, it is amazing how powerful song is. That was my non-answer to your question. Yeah. Anybody? Okay. Yes. Можно.
Вот в продолжение предыдущего вопроса, возможно, люди слушают простую музыку по той же причине, почему они читают простые книги типа детективы.
Чтобы было спокойнее.
Легче воспринимать,
может. Это трудно сказать, почему люди делают то, что они делают. Возможно.
Просто мой комментарий к этому вопросу, мне кажется, вы не зря сказали слово примитивно, поскольку даже я слышала мнение о том, что это какой-то evolutionary pole, то, что называется, поскольку это переносит нас к каким-то глубинам либо подсознания, либо каких-то субкогнитивных.
Есть, по крайней мере, есть теория об эволюции языка и музыки, что это одна эволюция или это разные эволюции. Это очень сложный вопрос. Но вот этот расскажет нам летом про язык, я не знаю, что он скажет про музыку. Но есть отличная книга Стивен Митhen. Стивен Mithun, something like, I have no idea what year, but it's called The Singing Neanderthals. The Singing Neanderthals. And it's a theory of the evolution of language, that there was a stage before language and music, where it was a kind of a combined system of communication, very primitive, and then it split. And his idea was the Neanderthals died because they had music, but the language that our species developed helped us to beat them because we could make a plan. With music, you can't make a plan, right? Like I'll come from the other side and stab them in the back, right? You can't make that plan with music. You're like, right? Yeah. So, but the connections, and there's another book called The Origins of Music, which is a series of articles, The Origins of Music, from a conference about the evolution of music, which I can't remember the editor, but that's the title of the book, and it has 20 articles about different theories of evolution of music, and these are great questions. I have no idea.
У нас был, по-моему, еще один вопрос, я думаю, что...
I had a question about ungrammaticality because you mentioned tonal music and that primarily we perceive music as tonal and we think of music as tonal. But there is also but there is also like the second Viennese school of music, which is a very, very popular in narrow circles.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, it's like Schoenberg and Berg,
of course. And Stravinsky also was radical with tonality and stuff like that.
Yeah, and the Soviet avant-garde music was, of course, drew a lot from it. And
absolutely.
My question is, do you think when we
because not everyone enjoys this sort of music, and there are lots of people who are going to say, "What is this? This isn't even music."
Right.
And but you do get a different feeling from listening, say like Schoenberg, than you have from listening to Mozart or Beethoven.
Right.
And do you think our brain goes like, "Hey, this is ungrammatical," and do you think that this sort of discomfort that we feel when we listen to Schoenberg is like the same phenomenon, that is the same feeling that we get when we hear an ungrammatical sentence?
It's a great question, right? I mean, this is really good. So, yes, to a degree, and here's the only qualification, is that tonality is not our kind of tonality, which is the same for you and me and probably everyone in this room, and it goes back hundreds of years. It hasn't changed as quickly as languages change, right? That is still one particular idiom. I mean, all systems have some tonality, but so does Schoenberg and Stravinsky. They just don't have the same tonality as we do. So it's more like listening to a foreign language that you don't understand, which doesn't make you feel bad because you just can't understand it, right? But so in a certain sense, I think yes. So that is to say, you could say, I mean, there's John Cage and radical avant-garde musicians like that who turn on 53 radio stations at the same time, and whatever they're playing, you turn your car on radio, and we just blast 53 different, and they call that music. Now, that, you can call that music, because I believe in avant-garde art. And you can call anything art, really, if you believe in it. I totally think so. But that doesn't tell us anything interesting about the way the human mind perceives music inside this mind. So it might be activity which is outside the musical module cognitively, and then we might not, so technically, for a cognitive scientist, it's 53 radios is not music. Okay, 53 radios technically for a cognitive scientist is not music in this sense of modularity, because we don't have a system ready to deal with 53 radios. Now, Schoenberg is somewhere in between, right? And that's why it's amazing. That's why avant-garde is so interesting, because it's pushing the boundaries of the cognitive norm, right? And whereas linguistic ungrammaticality, when I say, what did you meet an agent who likes? Well, it could be poetry, right? It could be avant-garde poetry. Then it's the same. But that, if we understand the norms, then we can understand the boundaries better.
So maybe music is more about sort of cultural framework, and language is more innate, more natural.
I think they both have a seriously significant cognitive component. And that's what we can learn from tonal music. Western tonal music is the most sophisticated system of music that we've ever had in the world, and so we learn the most from studying Western tonal music. It's very complicated and all of that. All languages are very, very complicated, so we learn a lot from studying them also. But there's a cultural component too, but the cognitive component is usually overlooked in music.